The guests are phenomenal, and every episode is packed with wisdom and practical insight. Some of my favorite divrei Torah and hashkafa have actually come from your podcast. Beyond that, though, it has fundamentally changed the way I think about networking and professional relationships.
I think that people really appreciate having kind of intellectual ballasting for a different approach that anyway may be intuitive to them. It's kind of like self-validating in a way that like, this is not just some squishy, feel-good Western approach to life. I think people are searching for authentic support in traditional sources, people that genuinely care about living their lives according to the Torah, al-Taharas HaKodesh.
I certainly think that the responsibility is 100% mine in framing the conversation and framing the episode. Rav Yehuda Levi is a clear and proud advocate for Har HaBayis in every fiber of his being. Maybe asking him to steelman the opposing, right, my role as a host, so maybe could have been a little bit wiser.
Yaakov, we would be completely remiss if we did not subject you to a Shtark Tank lightning round.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shtark Tank. Shtark Tank is a podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a mentor in the workforce. Here in the summer, I wanted to take a break from our regular interviews with various mentor in the workforce and take a moment to review some of the very excellent messages and feedback that I've gotten on this podcast from you, our amazing listeners. And in order to do that and to spruce some life into it, I'm honored to invite Rav Ari Koretzky to join us as a co-host today. Rav Ari is the director of Maryland Meor. He's also the host of the Iyun podcast, highly recommended. And he's also a host of a non-active podcast called Jews You Should Know, highly recommended. It was around way before podcasts were cool, way before all these fancy mics and stuff. The audio quality, if you don't mind me saying, is not great, but the quality of the conversations very much makes up for it. I think there's over 200 episodes back in the feed, so highly recommend everyone going and checking that out. So Rav Ari, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Yaakov, here on the Shtark Tank. I made it to the big leagues. Unbelievable. And a really phenomenal podcast with so many important voices that you've been platforming over the years. And really, really great to be here with you.
Amazing. So this is exciting, and I'm looking forward. We have so many messages. We'll see how much we can get to in the time that we have today. So I wanted to start with two messages I got around our recent episode about teshuva with Rabbi Moshe Tarragon. One comes from my friend Zach Fish. Zach, many people might know him from Sofer AI. He wrote the following. He spoke about this teshuva episode and also other episodes we've done before the Yom Tovim, and he writes as follows. I really like the episodes that are before the Chagim. The episode before Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut made me cry. It really connected me to the heroic families who lost their loved ones al Kiddush Hashem. And the pre-Tishvav and pre-Pesach episodes were also excellent. Thank you, Zach, for this feedback. He also mentioned that he was speaking to a friend named Yoni Laub, who also reached out afterwards, who's also was listening to the pre-Tishvav episode, and he also really enjoyed it. Yoni wrote to me as follows. He wrote, I tried to listen to a lot of different shiurim over the course of the 9 days to get me connected to Tishvav, and I felt like the episode with Rav Moshe Tarragon was the thing that helped me connect the most. So ashracha and shkoyach to you. So thank you, Zach, and thank you, Yoni, for that feedback. And, one of the things that I was thinking about in this regard is you sort of do these pre-chag episodes very egocentrically, because I'm very busy. I don't have a lot of time to prepare for the Yom Tovim. So if I have a pre-yontif episode, then that gives me the excuse to research, to think, to listen, and to prepare. So that's why I do it. It's really for myself. And also, parenthetically, if I'm going to put out an episode that week, so it doesn't really make sense to put out a regular style episode when everyone's mindset is in Tisha B'Av. So there is a little bit of an audience engagement metric as well. But more broadly, before any chag, there are millions and millions and millions of shiurim that can be found on any which website. And so the question really becomes, why is there a need for Shtark Tank to be putting out pre-Yom Tovim episodes? So, Ari, what are your thoughts about the scene of pre-Chagim episodes, and why do you think that Shtark Tank might have a unique trigger, a unique angle here that maybe others don't have?
That's a great question. First of all, Rabbi Tarragon is amazing. I just have to put in a plug for him. He talked about poor audio quality, which is absolutely correct, especially on my older podcast. Even on my newer podcast, sometimes the audio is not as great as I'd like it to be, including Rabbi Tarragon's episode was probably one of the best episodes that I've done, but the audio was very, very faint on his end. So I was really, really disappointed about that, but I've become a huge, huge fan of his. It's an interesting question, and I would kind of throw it back to you, Yaakov, because you mentioned that it's sort of a self-serving pursuit, right? Which is fine. If you're going to be self-serving, you might as well do it when it comes to the areas of spiritual development and preparing for Yom Tov. I think that's an acceptable arena in which to be self-serving. But do you feel like when you're releasing these episodes, are they kind of like off-brand? I mean, if the Shtark Tank is really about, as you said at the beginning, the B'nai Torah in the workplace and learning how to create Kiddush Hashem and so forth. Of course, we're all thinking about Yom Tov and, taking off of the workforce to celebrate Yom Tov. But how do you kind of conceptualize or even justify these kinds of episodes outside of just saying, hey, I got to give some fodder to the themes of the day because nobody's really interested in, the traditional episodes that week? Like, you could just take off a week, right?
So that's a phenomenal question and a lot to unpack there. So maybe I'll mention just a few thoughts. Number one is it's a process and I'm still developing it. I haven't had that many chagim in the almost 3 years of Shtark Tank now. It come every few months. So, around Rosh Hashanah to take stock and take teshuva of our identity is a very good bridge and parallel and really sits on brand very well, as you mentioned. Before Pesach, I did something about, are employees really free? Is there a sort of slavery and freedom theme? We did that last year. This year, we spoke to baalabatim and b'nai Torah in the workforce to get their Pesach Vortlach. So it's a dynamic process, and some of them are certainly harder. Teshuva, there was no clear fit that I tied in explicitly, I don't think. So number one is that it's a process. Number two is something that I've been thinking about. The question is there a Shtark Tank hashkafa? Is there a hashkafic angle in the world of B'nai Torah in the workforce that is unique and underserved? The shiurim that are out there are mostly, you listen to your Rebbe from Yeshiva or Rav Vishal. So those are all amazing resources and people should definitely go out and utilize them. But the question then becomes, between the lines of Shtark Tank or as Shtark Tank develops without explicitly trying to do so, is there a hashkafic world that is not being addressed enough? And therefore to hear divrei Torah that are focused and geared towards that specific bent, is that maybe the value that's being added here, even if it's not directly connected to workplace identity and workplace freedom and slavery and stuff like that? So that's something that I think about a lot. And I'm wondering, you do a lot of podcasting, speaking to people from different parts of the Torah community. If I were to say that I've developed a baalabatim hashkafa, that would probably be looked down upon by many. But I'm wondering if there is a positive spin on that hashkafa, that people who have, a few things in common, whether it's their need to work. Some people are spoiled. They can sit around and hawk about different hashkafas. But if you're very busy all day, you don't really have that luxury. And it's really just somewhat of a survival mode and it's more tachlis. It's also the engagement with the outside world, which in other areas, kids and in yeshiva can be debated and can be discussed. But for guys in the workforce, it's sort of forced upon you. Maybe a certain maturity of age post yeshiva is another factor, and maybe additional ones as well. So I'm wondering how you see that for all your different conversations with people in various parts of the Torah world. Is there a baalabatish world which has a lot of things in common, but isn't really treated as its own space?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think nowadays there are quite a lot of resources for every demographic, every baalabas and learner and whatever you might want to say. I mean, the level of learning among baalabatim, so to speak, is very high nowadays. Again, we're speaking in generalities here. There's so many different subsectors of the Orthodox community, if that's what we're really focusing on right now. I just wonder if in your situation, if you've really built this community, which it seems that you have so beautifully, then maybe there is, maybe the answer to my own question to you is that, the family is sort of celebrating Yom Tov together, like this is, you're going through the year, and yes, principally you're speaking about how to succeed and to synthesize your spiritual identity with your workplace identity and that whole, the whole vibe you have going of, Torah Im Derech Eretz kind of approach, which resonates with me, by the way, but that's neither here nor there. But that being said, maybe it's again, it's coming together, bringing the family together. You can't sit around the table, on Rosh Hashanah, on Shavuos, but you can have conversations that are aligned with those broader themes, that orient people of similar hashkafic dispositions around particular ideas and ideals. And of course, when you're sharing Torah, obviously it's going to be coming from that same sort of perspective, that same Weltanschauung, right? To use a fancy word. And people may appreciate that. And so people might say, hey, this is kind of my anchor. This is my spiritual, I don't want to call it a home, because maybe that's overstating things a bit, but this is a place that I turn to for encouragement, for chizuk, and for, a sense that I'm part of a community of like-minded people. And so, yeah, what's happening now is this Yom Tov's coming up, and I want to be hearing about that from this community, from that perspective, which is a perspective that affirms the value and even holiness of work, but also represents, greater ideas and allows us to think about the pauses in that work life throughout the year as it comes.
So that's actually a great segue to the next thing I wanted to talk about, and maybe a few other themes that you touched on. We'll have to come back to in some of the other messages that I have here on my desk waiting. But the next one actually very much clicks into what you're talking about, and I'll read it. So it goes as follows. Hi, Yaakov. I just want to say thank you for creating such an incredible podcast like Shtark Tank. I've been listening for quite a while now, and it's been one of the most insightful and impactful podcasts I've come across. The guests are phenomenal, and every episode is packed with wisdom and practical insight. Some of my favorite divrei Torah and hashkafa have actually come from your podcast. Beyond that, though, it has fundamentally changed the way I think about networking and professional relationships. I'm a baal teshuva, and the world of networking always felt superficial, as if relationships were primarily about what someone could do for you. It felt transactional, utilitarian, and superficial. Your podcast completely changed that perspective. After listening, I started reaching out to guests whose stories resonated with me. To my surprise, nearly everyone responded with incredible warmth and generosity. So many were happy to hop on a call, talk about life, work, and other advice. What began as professional conversations became genuine, meaningful relationships. Through the podcast, I've developed wonderful friendships, found mentors, been invited for Shabbos meals around Israel, and experienced firsthand just how extraordinary the Jewish community is. Because of that, Shtark Tank has become one of the first resources I recommend to baalei teshuva preparing to leave yeshiva and enter the working world. That transition can be intimidating, and your podcast gives people tremendous confidence. I encourage them to find someone whose career or story inspires them and simply reach out. I've seen people build relationships, find mentors, get interviews, and discover their interests because of your podcast. Thank you for everything you do. Your podcast has had a profound impact on my life and so many others. Wishing you continued hatzlacha. Signed, David DeBoer. So, wow, David, thank you so much for that message. Very, very special for me to hear. And, sometimes I'm sitting here in a room in the Negev late at night, pumping out edits and content and stuff like that. And you never really know, there are numbers, but numbers really are superficial. And this was really special to hear. So thank you for that, David. And, he certainly mentioned the networking and the community and the relationships that you were referring to very beautifully in your conversation. So before we maybe could talk about some other things that you heard of Ari and wanted to unpack a little more, I just want to say thank you, David. Thank you to all listeners who reached out. And for people who are listening and have not yet connected, I'm constantly thinking of ways to create sort of communal infrastructure. So, LinkedIn is a great way to reach me. My email is in the show notes, yaakovwolf@gmail.com, one word. We have a quiet WhatsApp group, which has created sort of networking effects and job opportunities. So there are many ways to get involved and get engaged beyond just people who are sitting there listening as they're washing dishes or going for a run. So I just wanted to emphasize that and remind the listeners that it's certainly welcome. I certainly appreciate it. It's not a bother. It's something that really gives me a lot of chizuk and strength. So I want to reiterate that. So, Rav Ari, hearing about that community and the other things that David mentioned, baalei teshuva, what are some of the things that you might want to talk about a little more?
First of all, I love that letter. In particular, I don't know how many people, even my podcast listeners, know or are aware that my full-time job is Kiruv Rechokim outreach. I've been doing that for 22 years. I work on a college campus, University of Maryland, but also more widely with students from around the country. Right now, as we sit here, I'm the last couple of days of an internship program that I run for 34 students from 18 different universities around the country, where they live together in the DC area, and we find them internships in their specific fields, pre-med, engineering, law, government, etc., and also give them a whole variety of Jewish experiences, learning and Shabbos and things like that. So in that way, this feels like that letter really feels like the convergence of all of these different elements together of the professional and the baalei teshuva and all of that. So really amazing email, and it's fascinating because it's to me a little bit counterintuitive that a person would find this as kind of their entryway into, I guess, how to adjust themselves to a new reality as they go to work. You would think that, they're coming from a yeshiva and they're getting all the chizuk there, and, the rebbeim might be pumping them up how to, be successful out in work. But, on further meditation, I guess it makes perfect sense that you want to learn from and commiserate with or, collaborate with those who are already out there in the working world and making a serious attempt to preserve and maintain fidelity to their Jewish values and their Jewish growth, and not just seeing work as kind of this, this b'diavad, as we would say, this sort of afterthought or, unfortunate reality that a person has to contend with, but actually as a source of great expression, personal expression, and even spiritual expression. So I'm really touched by that letter. And I think it's incredible to the degree that you can build a community of working people who want to not just be in a holding pattern, but to strive and to grow and to develop themselves over time, perhaps in different ways, different iterations, throughout their lives and their careers. I think that's phenomenal. And I can see how this really could be an unsung resource for those who are just starting to find their way, maybe have gotten to Judaism in a more monolithic sense, and now are seeing how it can actually be applied throughout all dimensions of life.
May I just ask you, because you are as you said, the Kiruv expert in general, and certainly far beyond my understanding of that world. It's something that came up in the very early days of the podcast that I realized that a lot of baalei teshuva were listening and connecting and enjoying, and I'm obviously thrilled about that. It was obviously not something that I ever really planned. It was more geared towards going back to the ego, myself and my chevra, who were coming from a certain regular Orthodox background and learned and started in yeshiva, transitioning to the workforce, making that transition, growing and not receding, and having a positive and growth-oriented mindset. So it was not something which I planned, certainly not saying of any nagdut, any sort of, my English is opposition. So certainly no problem whatsoever, but it's just interesting and surprising. So how would you define the differences in those two types of populations, right? They're both coming from a closed yeshiva to the outside world, finding a different hashkafa, applied hashkafa that will help them. So there's certainly commonalities, but certainly a lot of differences in the mindset and the background and the approach. So maybe you could share some of your experiences about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about baalei teshuva, those who are on a real Jewish growth path from either an unaffiliated background or a minimally affiliated background, a certain non-Orthodox background, I think it's very, very important. And I think most of the baalei teshuva yeshivas and organizations in general, especially today in 2026, make a great effort to underscore the value of living an integrated, holistic life, not to be, quote unquote, just rejecting one's past, entirely, but wholesale, but to be able to really bring with you the talents and abilities and interests, proclivities that you may have had previously, and even if you had previous jobs or certainly training for jobs in university or graduate school, et cetera, and to really bring that into one's life. That, first of all, that's the healthiest way to live. And second of all, because it's really not practical to just completely, and for most people at least, to completely, cut oneself off from that, in any sort of way. And a person needs a path forward in life, and a person needs to make a parnasa and to have a vocation as they continue to grow Jewishly. So I think that given that tremendous emphasis, right, and the person should learn for a couple of years, do the best they can, and then get out there into the workforce and create that synthesis and be that living Kiddush Hashem, I think a podcast like this is extremely important, and especially for baalei teshuva who may not have those role models, right? In other words, they may have grown up with either parents or relatives or bosses or things like that who may epitomize or represent professional success, and then they may have rabbis who epitomize or represent spiritual success, but rarely might they have those figures in their lives who harmonize those two aspects together. And so giving them those voices, giving them those mentors, giving them those people they could reach out to, as you've said so beautifully, that is an opportunity that this podcast presents. I think that's really, really important. Whereas someone coming from a traditional Orthodox background, certainly from a modern Orthodox background, has undoubtedly grown up with many role models who have synthesized Torah or Torah Im Derech Eretz, or whatever moniker we might ascribe to it. They certainly have those ideals and those mentors, that they have already been able to think about and look to. Of course, we can all use the chizuk, as you've said, and the help moving forward in our own individual lives and our own journeys. But for a baalei teshuva, this may be some of the first people they've encountered outside of maybe Shabbos hosts and things like that, who really do embody those shared ideals.
Right. I'm curious, you alluded to the fact that there's like a real need to acknowledge that reality of an integrated Torah living. So how would you see that being balanced? If you have a yeshiva geared towards baalei teshuva and they're so behind, quote unquote, on the learning, so you really need to, as intense as some of the other yeshivas like Kiruv or whatever might be, there's a massive gap in knowledge. And so that would lead me to think that there's a push to have the best Rebbeim and most intense learning and the more narrow sense of Talmud Torah and focus on that versus the need to prepare them in not so long to have the broader worldview and those role models. So have you seen that balance in any sort of interesting and creative ways?
Yeah, it's a good question. And obviously learning is a lifelong process. So nobody's walking out of 2 years of a Balchuva yeshiva as a great Talmud Chacham. And there are people that spend more time than that. They'll matriculate into more quote unquote mainstream yeshivas to continue their learning. It is amazing though, how much a person can make up in a short period of time with a tremendous desire, a ratzon, a chukka, as we say. It's pretty amazing. Sometimes that, might lead one to feel kind of depressed about, where other people might be at given the head start. But a person really can catch up quite quickly. I'm not to say that they're going to have all of the dios, all of the, the general knowledge, certainly not the cultural bearings, after a couple of years. Again, different people have different levels of intelligence, of aptitude, integration abilities, EQ, IQ, et cetera. There's so many factors. But yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, yeah, of course, would it be nice for a person to learn for 10 years and kind of quote unquote catch up? Sure. And there are individuals for whom that's the right path. But for most people, that's simply not an actionable approach. And so they need to, wherever they're at the end of those few years, they have to have a concrete continuing education plan, so to speak. But they've got to also be able to integrate into their fields of choice.
Okay, beautiful. So let's go to our next topic. Episode that we had at the beginning of the 3 weeks with Rav Yehuda Levi about Har HaBayis received a lot of feedback.
Great episode. Very provocative.
Thank you. I did want to give voice to some of the pushback because I think it's a machlokas l'shem shamayim and a lot of very interesting people reached out. We did, by the way, I did put out some messages looking for someone who would be a guest on an episode devoted to the other side of the debate. Not yet, haven't yet found anyone, so at least we'll do this for now. And so Naftali Casorla from Orlando, a very wonderful guy who I've connected with recently on this issue, actually. So he wrote me a very long, very beautiful message. I'll read some of it. I don't know if I'm going to get to all of it, and I hope to be able to choose at least some of the main points here. And he writes as follows. I think the discussion around Har HaBayis deserved a much stronger treatment of the opposing position than it received. My primary issue is not that there are no respectable halachic opinions permitting assent. There clearly are. Nor is my argument that every posting who permits going is somehow outside the mainstream. The issue is whether the opposing position was presented fairly and in its strongest form. He continues to write, I think 2 major arguments against ascending were never seriously engaged. So I do want to mention those. The first is the meta-halachic and security consideration. I got this from a few people. This is not some outdated concern that has faded with time. If anything, the security realities surrounding Har HaBayis have only become more volatile. The fact that organized ascents often require significant military and police protection demonstrates that this is not merely a technical halachic discussion. Whether one ultimately agrees that these considerations should influence psak is a legitimate debate, but pretending they are insignificant or no longer relevant is simply not an accurate presentation of the opposing views. That's point number 1, is the security and the broader, sort of not purely halachic, but some of the broader meta-halachic considerations.
And just to interject there, am I not mistaken that I believe the second intifada was the proximate cause that was, again, it was a justification and so forth, but was Sharon's assent to the Har HaBayis, I believe. So I think that is a very interesting point.
Right. It is an interesting point, although I do think that even the historians have nitpicked or talked a little bit about to what extent that statement is like completely true, or maybe there are some other factors at play as well. It's certainly something worth mentioning. I think it's also worth mentioning that the current government has many ministers who are going up, and Baruch Hashem, we don't yet see anything like that, but that doesn't necessarily prove anything. And so I'll go on to the second point, and he writes, the second is the underlying halachic dispute itself. Much of the permissive position depends upon identifying the boundaries of the mikdash and relying upon particular understandings of the Radbaz's testimony. But that premise is itself disputed by major poskim. Moshe Sternbuch, for example, develops a substantial halachic argument challenging whether the Radbaz's measurements and identifications can be relied upon in practice. One may disagree with his conclusion, but it is hardly a superficial argument. It deserves to be confronted directly rather than ignored. So there's a lot more here. I did want to mention maybe 1 or 2 other things here. He wrote that after your episode, I love this part, I posted some of my thoughts on my WhatsApp status, and I got a lot of different responses and feedback from all over the world. So I'm glad that Shtark Tank leads to a WhatsApp status, which leads to more important conversations. And he shared some of the feedback. One thing that struck me after posting my thoughts wasn't simply the number of responses. It was a remarkable consistency in where thoughtful people seem to converge. As someone who teaches and mentors many students, I care less that people agree with me than that they learn how to think carefully. The ensuing discussion was thoughtful, respectful, and at times surprisingly nuanced. There were certainly disagreements about the practical halacha and whether changing circumstance can ever alter long-standing psak. Those are legitimate discussions and no serious person should pretend otherwise. But there were a few points that repeatedly surfaced. And I'll just mention one. He said, the most interesting discussion, however, centered on motivation. Several students observed that some of the contemporary rhetoric surrounding Har HaBayis seems driven less by halacha and more by a desire to demonstrate sovereignty, to prove to the Arabs or to the world that this is ours. Whether or not that accurately describes everyone advocating assent is besides the point. The broader observation was that this mindset feels fundamentally foreign to the traditional Haredi approach, which generally has never viewed symbolic assertions of national pride as sufficient justification for altering long-term religious practice. One student put it rather bluntly, if something truly belongs to you, you don't need to constantly feel compelled to prove it. So a lot here. I want to actually, before we talk about it, mention just a few other things of my own that I wanted to clarify to the audience. Number one of the reasons why I really want to do this episode is because as someone who lives in Eretz Yisrael, I think it's important that everyone realize that this is becoming very, very popular. The Har HaBayis movement is growing right before my eyes. I know that my WhatsApp status views are not a scientific social study of the data, but every year on Tisha B'Av and around different times, I see more and more people posting pictures. The pictures is a whole nother topic. Even people who I reached out to and was speaking about something completely different. He didn't post about it and you didn't hear my episode, but he's like, oh yeah, Tisha B'Av, I was on Har HaBayis. Like that was just, and it was my first time and I really felt very meaningful about that. So I think number one, the reality is, and it's not like I really don't think this is debatable and it's nothing to do with like the halacha, the hashkafa. It is becoming very, very popular. That's number one. Number two, amongst these people who I see going and know who are going, including some Rebbeim who I look up to very highly, but even just like baalabatim who I know, they're not, there's like a stigma that some people maybe, or Naftali alluded to a little bit, and other people said it to me more bluntly. These are people who are going lahachis and to anger the Arabs and to make them upset and to stoke the flames. So almost all the people I know very much do not fall into that category. They're very normal baalabatish guys who have their head on straight. And so those are a lot of people who I know going up. So that's another thing that I do want to just report as a fact. And the third thing, which Rav Naftali didn't actually mention, but many listeners reached out to me and they said some version of, I don't feel worthy. I don't feel ready. I don't feel like this is for me right now. That's a whole nother thing, which is like, it's not even mutter or usser. It's like, is this what I should be doing now? So much to talk about here. Rav Ari, I'm happy for you to sort of tell us where you want to start, what you found to be the most compelling points of discussion and argument, and how it touches upon some of the things that you're seeing. The podcast that you're doing, the Iyun podcast about the Geula, Torah, values, halacha, being active, being passive, all these things all converge in so many different ways around this hot button topic. So I'm happy to hear from you where you want to unpack a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we did just do recently a long episode about the approach to the Geula, whether we should be, the traditional Haredi approach was kind of, outside of Chabad, to kind of just sort of do mitzvahs and let it sort of, what happens. The Geula is something we daven for, we talk about, but we don't really try to agitate for or, strategize, strategically, bring to us. And this guest, Pinchas Freudiger, was arguing that we should be much more active in our position. Really, he talked about it in terms of justice and creating a world of justice and so forth. There's a lot to say on that topic, but yes, I was fascinated by what you brought. And my number one response was like this Rabbi Kasorla, that it seemed like he was sketching the topic as if there is no true substantive critique, that the only available critiques are hashkafic or, those built on precedent, or you didn't get so much into it, but the security kinds of arguments and so forth, which again, I'm not underselling those, but I didn't hear a lot of he really made a pretty sweeping charge, which is that there's basically no debate about this. And it's ironic because the Rav of my shul, is a Haredi person, gave a series of shiurim, I believe it was or Pesach or Shavuos, I can't remember now, where this was the topic, and basically came out to the exact opposite conclusion, that there is no real justification going up to Har HaBayis, right? And so I must, I'm led to believe that there, people's starting points have to be informing their conclusions here. Now, it is interesting that, your guest did start in the Haredi world. It sounds like he's kind of maybe migrated on some level, but that is interesting. So, and that does sort of counter what I just said, but I don't know. It's in some way, it just seems that you could identify a person's hashkafa and then from there generally conclude or, predict their their position on this stance. And it must be that there are other substantive, responses here, some of which I guess Rabbi Kasrula outlined, namely the measurements of Har HaBayis, like Rav Sternbach and perhaps others. So that's really what stuck out to me when you brought this guest on. The claim was very sweeping, and it just struck me as there must be some opposing voice there, not just on the hashkafic level or on the meta halachic level, but on the substance of the arguments themselves.
So I'll jump in here because I do think it's a very fair point what you and Rav Naftali are mentioning. And I do want to say that I certainly think that the responsibility is 100% mine in framing the conversation and framing the episode. Rav Yehuda Levi is a clear and proud advocate for Har HaBayis in every fiber of his being. And I invited him on, which I don't regret in one bit. Maybe the asking him to steelman the opposing, right, my role as a host. So maybe could have been a little bit wiser by not getting into that. I don't know. Maybe it could have gone differently, but he's certainly he's not ashamed of what he does. He has Rabbanim who he consults with, and that's why I certainly view him as a legitimate person to speak to, not beyond the pale in any way, shape, or form. But maybe there's some sort of responsibility of my own as a host that should be clarified and sharpened.
I am really curious as you talk about, why you selected to do that episode, and, what is the goal of an episode that is really more provocative in nature and is not really directly about either work or the upcoming Yom Tov. I guess in that case, Tisha B'Av was sort of the tie-in. But yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating topic, as you said. It's becoming very prevalent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's relevant to your specific audience.
So there was a bit of a Chagim tie-in. Rav Yehuda's also combines professionalism with what he's doing, which wasn't the main focus, I admit, but was also part of it. And I think the most important thing, which is seeing this growth in popularity and hearing some people talk about it in a very, very interesting way, I thought it was worth it putting it in front of the audience, going back to the Shtark Tank hashkafa, to at least take the topic seriously. Because I think a lot of people will assume, yeah, there's a bunch of crazy guys who live on hilltops and they were in caves and whatever, and they're trying to light the country on fire and they're a fringe. So it's certainly not the case. And based on our conversations with some of these people, I thought it was worth it for people to at least ask themselves the question, do you really understand what the issues are? Take it seriously. And I think I was successful based on some of the response that I got. So I think that was, in a nutshell, what I was trying to do, those sort of three things.
Fair. I mean, it definitely is a topic that I learned a lot about listening to it. And it was, again, his level of confidence and conviction definitely, kind of made me think, because he wasn't just saying, yeah, I think it's justifiable. He was saying it is, unequivocal, and therefore really strongly endorsing the practice. So I found it very, very interesting. Absolutely.
Right. So on this episode, I got a message, and I didn't ask this person for Rishos to read his name, but he wrote as follows: was this your first foray into the world of controversial topics? You can do many others like it. Interfaith dialogue, Hilltop Youth. It'll be great for listener numbers. So many ways to get people fuming. Oh, even better, he writes. This is a bunch of WhatsApps that he kept on sending me. A nursing home owner, or even better, cash advance. So jokes aside, I think there's a very important topic here that I think about all the time as a podcast host, which is the fact that, clickbait is real and people's attentions are being fought over by many different pieces of content. Any Shtark Tank listener who opens up his Spotify will have a lot of other things vying for his thumb to click on before he decides what he's listening to on his way to work. And it's certainly something which I am aware of and I struggle with. And I'm wondering how you think about that. You're also hosting a podcast where you're trying to have very mature and sophisticated conversations, touching on or straight on very, hot topics, whether it's Harim in the army or the protests, which you did a great episode on recently. I have some other, whatever. I did something about protests, which I'm not talking about right now. So I'm wondering how you think about that as a content creator in this very, very cutthroat world where you really need to earn people's attention, being a sophisticated and mature and responsible Torah voice, but also, you got to play the game a little bit with the class and whatever. So I'm wondering how you approach that.
Yeah, and to even strengthen your question, rather than, or at least before answering it, I think when it comes to topics of the Haredi society, so you're talking definitionally about a society that is, that is built on a sense of dogma. I'm not using that word pejoratively. I'm just using it descriptively, and that fully open inquiry is not, necessarily a value. Certainly when it comes to particular topics, around the bedrock Haredi societal topics, let's say. And if you want to have any influence, or if you want your voice to be taken seriously within a community, then any critique has to be done from within the frame of reference of the people that may be listening. I recognize that nobody in Mei Shearim or Carlin Stolen is listening to my podcast, most likely, right? But if we're talking about the sort of the soft Haredi, middle, so to speak, the English speaking part of that world, then it has to be done with deference and with derech eretz and with an appreciation for Torah leaders and not sensationalistically, right? It's got to be done in a way that seems to be honoring and taking seriously the mores and ways of living that are so sacred to so many people, even if I disagree with any one or more of them, but simply to engender any sense of credibility and to affect any kind of evolution or change. And so I really think about it seriously, because the moment I become a sort of a shock jock, right, as much as that may double or triple or 10x my numbers, it also then puts me on the outside, and I become just an outside, a critic, as opposed to a insider, or at least quasi insider. I do kind of straddle multiple worlds, but someone who values and appreciates that world and doesn't see it as, just this kind of lecherous, very broken, corrupted enterprise, which many people do see it as, and make that very clear in their writing or their speaking and the rhetoric and so forth. So I think it's really important if you want to have that impact, not to position yourself as that sort of sensationalist, yellow, muckraking, yellow journalist, so to speak. Now, that being said, how do you treat those topics? Well, I think you have to treat them, first of all, by trying the best you can to find those who can rationally and coherently articulate the more, call it extreme or more right-wing position. Because if you don't do that, then again, you're just beating up a straw man, potentially. Now, it happens to be very difficult to find those people, whether because they aren't generally as schooled in, rather in English language debate, or, in just debate generally speaking when it comes to these kinds of topics, or because there is kind of a code of silence around some of these topics. And there's a sort of a sense that this is ultimately kind of a rabbinic dictate. And this is something that this is the way things are. And who are we to question? And even to try to rationalize positions of great rabbanim, and even trying to do that can come off as kind of being, as if misrepresenting their real views, or, like they say the old story about Rav Chaim Brisker used to say, give me the psak to the dayan in Brisk, give me the psak, but don't give me the reason, because once you give me the reason, I'm gonna disagree, I'm gonna slug it up, and I won't trust the psak anymore. There's a little bit of that goes on in the Haredi space. As soon as we sort of articulate it in normal, terms of debate, then that lends it to disruption and to dispute, and that can't be tolerated because of the necessary social cohesion that really binds the society together. So it really becomes difficult to find those people to kind of steelman, as you said previously, those arguments. I try, I'm not always successful, but I think that is the responsibility of anyone wading into these controversial waters.
Interesting. Maybe one or two things I want to ask you about. Number one, it's impossible to avoid receiving harsh criticisms. You're never going to be perfect, and you're always going to find people, especially on the internet, who hide behind anonymity, who are going to reach out. I'm wondering if you take that at all harshly in any way, shape, or form. I actually got a comment last night, which was from someone who's I had seen online and have respect for, and it was a very harsh comment, and it was not a pleasant experience for me. I'm wondering what your experiences are about that. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to ask you is, like, being in the space of, online content, for me sometimes feels like, I'm trying to play a game which is not built for me. It's built for people who have very extreme opinions or very flashy. Also I spend a little bit too much time on LinkedIn promoting the podcast. So I feel like I'm like a fish out of water, like ger toshav. I feel just like a ger and alaka toshav in these spaces. I'm wondering if you feel the same way in your endeavors of sharing Torah online in a playing in a game which seems to be stacked up against guys like me and you.
Yeah, first of all, 100%. Let's go to your first question first, because the answer is easy. Yes, I do get such criticism from time to time, not an overwhelming amount. And yes, it bothers me each time and hurts me. And I have thin skin, and I want people to like me, and I want to be, I want to be accepted, so to speak, in all different communities. And with that, of course, is difficult when you're speaking about things. But there's a deeper layer that I just can't be silent. It just bothers me. These topics just somewhere deep in my soul. People ask me, like, what do you care so much? Like, most people just go about their lives and, like, I don't know, you just live, It's like, I don't know. There's something that's implanted within me that really is like existentially is uneasy, can't rest without really grappling with these topics. So that's number one. Number two, yes, 100%. And people have pushed me very often. There's certainly certain particular, I'm not going to name them, but online media personalities who have said, Ari, you have such great content, you have such great stuff. You've got to get way better with X, Y, or Z marketing, repackaging, all that. And they're 100% right. They're 100% right. However, my two responses to that, number one is a practical response, which is that this is not my job. It's a tachbiv, as you would say in Hebrew. It's a hobby. It costs me money. It doesn't generate me money. And I'm extraordinarily busy with my other endeavors and my outreach. And of course, Baruch Hashem, I have a family and so forth. And so that's number one. I don't have the time or resources, financial resources, human resources and time resources, temporal resources to do that. But number two is really more fundamental, more philosophical, which is that I don't want to play that game. I just don't, I'm averse to the kind of the clickbaity, superficial, flashy kind of podcasting. Again, I'm very friendly with some of the people that do that, and I don't judge them in any way because it works for them and they do a lot of good with it. They do a lot of good for it. It's just, I don't want to swim in that pool. You know what I'm saying? It's like it's a different arena, and I'm cool if people, far fewer people listen, but they're people of great substance and depth, and that are, maybe they're more thought leaders. Maybe they're people that are, going to be setting the agenda, or maybe even not. Maybe they're just people that are, fellow, travelers on this particular road. And it may be, a road that doesn't hold all that many people, but for those people, it's meaningful. It's significant. And because I'm not relying on this for my parnasa or, not trying to build a personal brand or anything like that. So I don't feel the need. Again, people push back. No, it's so important and you need to get it out there. Okay, I hear it, but there's a trade-off. Again, both in terms of time and investment, but also in terms of, quote unquote, selling out and, moving myself into a different lane, into a different pool. And I'm just not willing to do it. I'm not interested in doing it. I'm allergic to it. You can call that elitist. Maybe it is. And that's okay. I'm okay with that because I think that there's an important role for that kind of conversation. And it could be that your podcast and or at least some of your episodes fall into that category as well. And I mean, how do you think about it? Are you kind of thinking about it similarly in terms of, being okay with just kind of accepting your lane and embracing it? And even at the cost of listenership numbers?
Yeah, it's first of all, I really appreciate everything you said. Really resonates. And I wasn't expecting this to be podcasters therapy here, but I'll take it when I can get it. But certainly it's not a parnasa. It's something which I do because I love it very much. But not costing money and not making money is also true of me as well. The thin skin for the feedback is also extremely true for me as well. So I appreciate you sharing that. I think that I certainly try to stay mission focused, but it's not easy when so much noise, so much stuff going on. It's certainly tantalizing to do that. And I will say one other thing, which is that I take solace in the fact that a lot of listeners have actually reached out to ask me about similar questions of media usage and sharing online with similar dilemmas, which I guess means that I'm doing something right. And as much as I have a lot of lack of self-confidence into how well I'm doing it and certainly spend way too much time on certain things at certain points, I do think that, Baruch Hashem, with a lot of siyata d'shmaya and a lot of trial and a lot of error, I've been able to find somewhat of a balance. And I think the fact that people reach out to me to ask for advice on some of these inyanim, I think is validating in that regard. So we're running a little short on time. There are a few more important things that I want to hit on here. So let's try to keep them brief. But Baruch Swinkin from Ramat Beit Shemesh gave me a very beautiful message. And I'll just read one or two sections here. He writes, Shtark Tank offers thoughtful conversations with exceptional individuals who have navigated these struggles alongside honest discussions with people who are simply living the same balancing act as the rest of us. There is no political agenda, no attempt to convince anyone to adopt a particular worldview. The goal is simple: to provide chizuk, perspective, and practical wisdom while reminding us how much we truly share. There are precious few forums where Jews from different backgrounds can genuinely listen to one another. In an age when it often feels difficult to get two Jews with differing perspectives to sit around the same table, Shtark Tank creates a welcoming space where they can do just that. It encourages us to appreciate our common mission, learn from one another, and strengthen the bond that unites us as one people. So thank you, Baruch. Very, very beautiful message, and I really appreciate that. And I guess the question then becomes, right, there are various Achdus branded initiatives. And my thought based on Baruch's comment is the best way to create Achdus to ignore Achdus, right? Like for me also, like I try to be an Achdus, but there's certainly challenges. I live in Eretz Yisrael. It's not easy at all. So I'm wondering, just like, is a covert mission the best way to fight this war? Based on what Baruch's saying, that like Shtark Tank had no agenda to be an Achdus place, but I do get what he's saying. You're going to come on, you're going to hear a guy who's talking about the Sefer he wrote in the army, and you're going to hear another guy who's a Rav who's never whatever. So like, and obviously my guests. Right, little secret, spoiler alert, the guests certainly skew towards my personal network. So I don't know if that shocks anybody. And that is certainly more of the Dati Leumi, Sirius Torani, YU, KBY, whatever, all of these wonderful institutions certainly is biased in that sense, not ashamed of it. But in the end of the day, there are people who I look up to from various different communities. I bring them on, I learn from them. The listeners also come from, sort of track onto that similar map. And then the question becomes, is that like the best way for someone who wants to create Achdus is to find the covert ways to do it and not say, this is an Achdus podcast, which people are not going to want to listen to?
Well, I hear there is that you're orienting people around substance. So I don't know if it's the aspect of, coversion versus oversion, so forth, as much as it is that you're having conversations that are substantive that almost invariably end up expressing shared values and shared ideals. And so when you hear these people, let's say that you would have assumed are A and really they're B, once you hear them talk about their lives, right? You're not just arguing. It's not because you, in my opinion, because you're coming to it kind of like around the back and kind of, through the back door. It's more that it's because you're just getting to know them as people. And once you see that they're people, the differences feel, reduce in importance, and the similarities and the shared values elevate, and all of a sudden you have Achdus, So I think it's really a function of having substantive conversation around important topics, and almost by definition, by extension, you're having the Achdus is a byproduct.
Amazing. So the next thing I wanted to jump to is the fact that, this is not actually a particular message I'm going to read, but I'll just share that for me, a great indicator of a powerful message, of a powerful episode, is the amount of people who will reach out on their own volition and say, Yaakov, I enjoyed today's episode. Great job. I really appreciated that. And the episode with Rav Rafi Dembovsky, who recently published a sefer on Torah Im Derech Eretz called Between Torah Im Derech Eretz, was surprising in that regard. I got a lot of messages saying that was a really good episode. I really enjoyed it. And it was a little bit surprising because when I recorded it and put it out, it was a good episode. It was a solid episode. I wasn't expecting it to be one of the more popular episodes we've ever done. And that is true both of the listener episodes and of the amounts of feedback. And I'm wondering, Ari, I know that you read the book and was also intrigued by this topic. So I'm wondering, in your mind, again, I love Rafi. I don't want to say anything, whatever, but it was like a nice episode, and I wasn't expecting it to be as popular as it was. I wonder if you have any theories about why that might be so.
I do. And first of all, thank you, because I'm not sure if I heard about him from you or someone else, but as a result, I did interview him myself for the Iyun podcast, and that's coming out hopefully shortly. So we had a great conversation as well. My theory is as follows. I think that people intuitively have a certain worldview, have a certain way of thinking about the world, have a certain way of trying to express their Jewish identity in the world. And yet that seems to be challenged by a type of orthodoxy that's become really ascendant in our society. And I think that people really appreciate having kind of intellectual ballasting for a different approach that anyway may be intuitive to them. It's kind of like self-validating in a way that, like, this is not just some squishy, feel-good, Western approach to life that I may be trying to express or that really resonates with me, go to work and build the world and, all those different things that he's speaking about, Derech Eretz, right? And Midos Tovos, or manners even, and all of those kinds of things that fall under the rubric. I think people are searching for authentic support in traditional sources, people that genuinely care about living their lives according to the Torah, Al Taharas HaKodesh, want to know that the way that their version of Yiddishkeit is not some sort of cop-out or is not at odds with true Jewish living, right? True Torah living, and that Nebuch, because they're just this kind of soft Western person, they have to sort of, give in to these kinds of needs and live their lives somewhat differently. But really, the way they should be living is this other way, this other model, right? So what Rav Rafi has done, I think, is demonstrate an entire tradition, historical and very much grounded in Chazal and sources, and of course, most recently embodied by Rav Hirsch, that allows one to feel like, okay, I'm an authentic Torah Jew, and this is maybe a different path, separate but equal, if you will, a different sort of line of tradition that allows me, yes, to feel more resonant, to feel more authentic, but to do so really genuinely within the bounds of Torah living.
So that's very interesting. I think that that idea of self-validation is something which I also was thinking about in this context. I think it deserves a much greater treatment, and we're going way over time here, so we're going to leave it for a side, but thank you for pointing that out. Because we'll just hit on a few more quickly here as we wind down. So this is actually, I'm just going to read out a message as follows. This has nothing to do with really the episode itself, but just a friend of mine who wrote to me, Yaakov, please don't tell anyone, but I'm looking for a new job. This guy is a well paid at a successful tech company, a good friend of mine. And when we hopped on a call to speak about it, he said he really feels a lack of meaning in his work. And he knows that I work for a nonprofit. And he was thinking that maybe if a nonprofit like mine had an opening, he would feel a little better. And I'll be honest, I've received this conversation at least once a month for the last, I can't even remember how many months. Someone reached out to me with some version of that conversation, which I find very, very interesting. And I just want to mention one thing which I told him and told every one of those callers who called over the last whatever, is that as someone who works in nonprofits, there are many people who are employed by an amazing mission-based, wonderful nonprofit, but the employee themselves is bitter and resentful and upset and underpaid and overworked. So if they think that the silver bullet is switching to a nonprofit, let's pause that right there. And that's certainly not true. It has to be thought of in a little more of a complex and holistic sense and more nuanced than a lot of the other conversations. So I just wanted to mention that. And I know that you've been around Jewish nonprofits, so I see you're nodding. So I don't have anything you want to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the grass is always greener, right? And so I think that every choice comes with trade-offs. A nonprofit, yes, there in theory at least should be a meaningful role. Again, maybe this guy would be at a more advanced level and maybe be coming to be a CEO or executive director and taking over an organization. Maybe have a little bit more autonomy and wouldn't be as underworked or as overworked and as underpaid. He probably still will. Well, he definitely will still be underpaid relative to what he's earning now, unless he's taking over like a massive, legacy institutional organization, of which there are probably, 5 or 10 in the world, that are making comparable salaries to, serious private sector executives. So there are always trade-offs. And I think that what this does lead to is more of a meta question, which is really much more in your territory than in mine. But thinking about, from whence does one derive one's meaning? Is meaning meant to be derived from work? Is work meant to be this one source of meaning? And I can hear different perspectives. I mean, there is, the Chovos HaLevavos says that you should look for a job that meets multiple criteria, one of which is something that you're good at, one of which is something that's needed, right? And something that you can earn a living, earn a parnasa. That's a need in the world. And so I think that, and I'm not sure if I got that entirely correct, but along those lines. So, there is a school of thought that says, get meaning, right? Do something. You're working more hours than you are doing anything else in life. Make sure it's meaningful. Make sure that's a source of something, do what you love. You'll never work a day in your life. That kind of approach. There's a totally other approach, which is work is to put food on the table, punch your clock, make as much money as you possibly can, within obviously something that's honest and, filled with integrity and so forth. And then use your spare time, your free time, your discretionary time to generate meaning, whether that's from learning Torah, whether that's from doing chesed, whether that's from volunteering for the same nonprofit that he otherwise would be working for and maybe become bitter or resentful over. Instead, he can become, a lay leader and so forth. So there are different schools of thought. I don't know if you've explored this extensively on the show, but that's kind of what comes up for me when you talk about this question of meaning at work.
I guess, yeah, it's certainly something we have talked about and we'll talk about. I think the other thing I want to just get your take on is, you see people, students of yours, they go out to work. Do you find this to be a big deal amongst the populations and the communities that you are involved in? Have you noticed any sort of generational gaps between different age groups and how they relate to this issue?
Well, today people jump around between jobs so frequently, it's hard for anything to get stale. People are looking for fulfillment and meaning at work. They are. It doesn't necessarily mean like existential meaning, but certainly some sort of resonance, some sort of sense that they're making an impact. I think that is true of younger people. I think older generations, certainly my parents' generation, you stayed at a company for 30, 40, 50 years. Meaningful, the word meaning, in general, the word meaning was kind of like, a luxury, luxury beliefs, as Rob Henderson maybe calls them. It's like we're talking about survival, not meaning. So maybe that's a product of our affluence that we even have that capacity to think about that or talk about work in those ways. When we're not for the most part going to coal mines and risking our lives just to be able to eat supper every day. So yes, people are thinking on those terms and they're looking for it constantly, moving from place to place. I don't think that's particularly healthy either, because you're never really vesting anywhere. You're never really building institutional knowledge. You're never really building deep relationships with people that can impact you and educate you, but also help you in a much more profound way later on. So I think there's maybe a balance that could be struck here. But yes, young people are looking for that. Again, whether that means existential meaning or just some sort of resonance and personal self-expression, I think that's really more along the lines of what they're looking for.
Okay, so just two final messages. I got a message from Yehuda Eisenberg, who asked, what's the biggest lesson and takeaway from you from doing the podcast? That's a very loaded question after doing over 130 episodes. But if I had to choose one, I think it would be having a positive and upbeat, confident mindset is the one takeaway that I've seen so many times across different permutations and different guests and different realities. So keep it positive, keep it confident, understand that this is where Kadosh Baruch Hu wants you to be, and it's going to be okay. I think that's the answer to Yehuda's interesting question about the biggest lesson and biggest takeaway. And you'd also sent me another message. He asked, what is the one thing that you think is holding you back from more in Shtark Tank? Which is also a loaded question and touches on something we talked about a little bit. But, Shtark Tank is a passion project, which I do completely on the side. I think that one of the things that I'm thinking about all the time is the following dynamic. I think Shtark Tank could grow a lot if there were some sort of monetization element. At the same time, I do not want the content to be behind any sort of paywall. I don't want it to be cluttered with ads, and I don't want it to be influenced by ads. Those are two different things. Number one is having to skip ahead or listen to an ad read, but it's also, if I'm an advertiser who's paying for an ad space, so he has certain expectations of listener numbers and the freedom, which you alluded to before, of not having to deal with any of that is a luxury, which I don't plan on giving up anytime soon. So with all that in mind, I'm still thinking of maybe creative and interesting ways to find some sort of monetized element that might help us grow this project a little bigger. If any listeners have any ideas, want to reach out, I don't plan on fundraising. If anyone wants to donate, I'll give you some other great organizations. I don't want another nonprofit to fundraise for. I do enough for that in my day job. So that's just some final thoughts about the next sort of what's holding us back. What's the next stage? I think there is great potential. And also, by the way, I think that there's something very good about, even if I were to not end up doing that and continue to grow slowly or organically, the slow cook talent that really has something very special about that versus finding a quick fix where I can go viral and make $1 million. I think there's something very healthy about that. So we're trying to find a balance between those different things. Those are final thoughts. A big thank you to everyone for all their feedback. And I think we touched on all of the messages and always welcome to reach out. Again, email, WhatsApp, LinkedIn. I think anyone who wants to find me was not going to have a hard time. And Rav Ari, a big thank you to you for coming along and helping me really express some of the ideas and draw them out and hash them out with me. So thank you so much.
An absolute pleasure. And of course, before we get going over here, Yaakov, we would be completely remiss if we did not subject you to a Shtark Tank lightning round. So we're going to do that in wrapping up over here. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. They might sound familiar. I hope that you formulated your answers thoughtfully, as you've had quite a bit of practice or preparation time, 130 episodes worth to be exact. So here we go. We happen to be here in the summer, still nice long Shabbos afternoons. They're starting to get a little bit shorter, but we got a couple more months of it. What do you like to do with that time?
So I'll answer in a second. I do want to mention just one other important thing for any aspiring podcasters out there, that I started recording episodes before the name Shtark Tank came to being. I didn't wait. And even the lightning round came after 50 some episodes. So if you're stuck on little things like that, start your podcast, go for it, and you can work out these other popular features down the line. So just a note on that. Shabbos afternoons, look, as many people may know, I'm one of the most boring people out there. So I usually split the time between a little bit of resting, a little bit of time with the kids and family, letting my wife rest, and a little bit of time learning. The summer afternoons allows that all to happen more benachat and not condensed into the winter.
Now, when you are learning on that long Shabbos afternoon, presumably or potentially something about the Parsha. What would be your favorite sefer on the Parsha?
So I'm a big fan of the Netziv. We've discussed it on the podcast before, and he has a very interesting connection between his mentality and some of his ideas and Bnei Torah in the workforce. Another favorite of mine is Rav Schwab, Rav Shimon Schwab, the mind-based teshuva on the Parsha. Fascinating insights. He was also my grandparents' Messiah Kedushin, so an extra special connection there.
Beautiful. And finally, if you were forced to quit your job and switch to something new, maybe something you dreamed of doing as a kid, what would that be?
It would either be a jumbo jet pilot or a farmer.
Fantastic. And two very, very disparate answers, but who knows? Maybe in your dotage eventually, once you win the lottery, because it's not happening through nonprofit work, once you win the lottery, you'll get to train in either or both of those fields. Probably farmer is a little bit more realistic, helping make the Negev bloom down there, Yaakov. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Rav Ari, and thank you everyone for listening, and we will see you guys next time.